Well, welcome. I'm Phil Mullan. Welcome to the final session of the Economy Strand. A few of you, I think, have been here all day. Me and Catherine have been here most of the day in this room. It'd be nice tomorrow to have a change. This session was originally inspired by some ambiguous comments made before the general election by Keir Starmer about, he said, resetting Britain's relationship with Brussels, and the thought that this might mean the government seeking to water down Britain's departure from the European Union. Obviously, there's been more discussion about resetting since. But not much has happened concretely. Early days, they say, and the Cabinet seems to have had a few distractions in its first 100 days of events and self-inflicted mishaps. But the question of UK-EU relations, I think, certainly remains relevant, given not least the enduring presumption from some people that Britain's economic problems have been at the least exacerbated by Brexit, and with the persisting suggestion that some realignment with the EU could help to meet the government's stated #1 priority of growth. So to discuss the consequence of Britain's changing economic relationship, past, present and future with Europe, our panel this afternoon, in order of speaking, is first Catherine McBride, who some of you may have seen in an earlier session. She's an economist, a fellow for the Centre for Brexit Policy, and who's written with great rigour and detail on the impact Brexit has had on Britain's trade. And she's also a member of the Department of Business and Trade's Independent Trade and Agriculture Commission. After Catherine, we have here Dr. Thomas Sampson. He's an associate professor of economics at the London School of Economics, and he's an associate in the trade programme there at the Centre for Economic Performance, where he too has analysed the implications of Brexit for the UK economy. I think from what I've read of there is from a slightly different perspective to Catherine. Third, we have Ali Miraj. He's a media broadcaster, infrastructure financier, an experienced house music DJ. I always have to say that. But he'd also founded the annual Contrarian Prize, which recognises, quote, the independence, courage and sacrifice of British public figures whose ideas challenge the status quo. So very much a friend of the battle of ideas over the years with that sentiment. And then finally, we have Gawain Towler at the end of the table here. He's an experienced head of press and communications, formerly with the UK Independence Party, then with the Brexit Party, and until recently at Reform UK. Though I don't think there's been a fallout there, he's still very much a supporter of the Reform Party. He also runs his own PR firm, CWC Strategy, whose initials, I think, stand for Crisis What Crisis. Sorry. So, can we welcome our platform?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I really don't think that the Labour Party or any government in the UK is ever going to rejoin the EU, especially now that the EU is making itself so unattractive. Its own economy is in real trouble, and I think you'd be kind of crazy to join it. We certainly won't be rejoining an economic nirvana. Sorry if I could bring that closer. Since Brexit, we've done a lot of things that get virtually no press. We've adjusted a lot of our laws that get, unfortunately, virtually no attention. Everyone is worried about the cost of Brexit, but no one's looking at the advantages. A good example is right now the EU introduced a carbon border tax last year. We haven't introduced one. We do propose to do one in 2027, but we're going to do it on slightly different commodities. And that is because in the UK's economy, we are more interested in the carbon emissions of glass and ceramics, where the EU is not interested in those at all. So they did not include glass and ceramics in their carbon border tax. So what we've been able to do, even if you don't like Brexit, is we've been able to mimic the EU's laws, but tweak them so that they suit the UK economy. And that is a phenomenal advantage to any government, and one that most governments in the world outside the EU actually always enjoy, but it's one that we haven't been able to do for almost 50 years. And that comes in with everything. It was only in January this year that UK courts were finally the ultimate arbiters of UK laws. Up until that point, our judges had to take into account any EU laws. Also, Brexit has restored sovereignty to our parliament, so we get to debate things. So the UK introduced an online safety bill. The EU has a Digital Services Act. Our online safety bill bounced between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. There are a lot of amendments put to it. There's a lot of arguments, and Baroness Fox can probably give you the full blow-by-blow of what happened. But in the end, we got the rules we wanted. Had we still been a member of the EU, we would have had to impose their Digital Services Act as it was written in Brussels. We would have had nothing to do with that. And this has happened with financials as well. You know, we were going to take back control of our laws, our finance, our money, and our borders. Well, certainly in our money, we no longer pay 80% of our customs duty to Brussels, which we used to have to do. And we imported more goods from outside the EU than any other EU country. We no longer have to send a proportion of our VAT to the EU, nor do we have to send them an amount of money based on our national income. Now, also with VAT, the EU determined what the rate was, or the minimum rate. They also determined what goods we could put VAT on, what goods we could put a reduced VAT on, and what goods could be VAT-free. Since we left, the Conservative government dropped VAT on things that they want people to do, like solar panels, and now VAT-free, and electric heat pumps are VAT-free. So that's something that we could not do when we're members of the EU, which sounds really stupid when you think we've got a government that wants to encourage people to go into green technology. And yet, under the EU, we would have had to have added VAT to the cost of doing that. And it's already an expensive thing. The UK government also has dropped the nuisance tariffs. The EU loved tariffs, and they had tariffs on virtually everything, many of which were below 2%. Now, this isn't a big cost to the import, but it does mean that you have to fill in a lot of paperwork and you have to send some money to someone. We got rid of all of those, which was a fantastic boom to a lot of importers, because with modern manufacturing, there's a huge supply chain where parts are coming from all over the world and semi-finished goods are coming from all over the world, and they're getting put together. So to have a whole lot of below 2% tariffs was just a nuisance. And the government also got rid of 162 tariffs on goods that we don't make. Weirdly, we had to have import tariffs on things like orange juice and tropical fruit juices and nuts and ambient tofu, dried onions, all sorts of things that the UK doesn't actually make. But we still had to put tariffs on to protect someone in one of the 27 other EU nations. So the last Conservative government got rid of those, and that's a temporary suspension. It will expire in June 2026, but I really doubt that the Labor government will suddenly decide to start putting tariffs on tropical fruit juices again. We've also got to negotiate our own trade deals, and you've probably heard a lot about that. We rolled over all of the ones we have with the EU. We got a completely tariff-free and quota-free trade deal with the EU. We've done new deals with Australia, New Zealand and the CPTPP, also with Ukraine and the Eastern and Southern African countries. We've improved our agreement with Japan. We have a digital trade agreement with Singapore. We've created our own developing countries trading schemes, and we're still negotiating with South Korea, Switzerland, India, Israel, Canada, Mexico, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. So all of this stuff is happening, and we haven't had to do crazy things like the EU is about to put very high tariffs onto Chinese electric vehicles, even though they're also mandating that their population drive electric vehicles. And this tariff will not only affect the Chinese vehicles, but it'll also affect Minis and Volkswagens and Teslas, which are being made in China. So I could go on. We've got control of our borders. You probably know about that. We've got control of our waters. We can now close down the Dogger Bank and protect seabirds and sand eels from trawling. We can do all sorts of things that we couldn't do before. And the idea that the EU, that the Labour Party would want to go back and let the EU control of all of those things just appears to be madness because, these are things that members of the left and, the people in Lowestoft and Grimsby have wanted for years, and we finally got them. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. So the kind of main point I want to make in my remarks is to put forward the argument that the idea of global Britain, which we heard a lot about following the referendum and which was kind of the intellectual guiding star for UK trade policy over the last 8 years or so, that this idea has failed, and that we're now at a point where we can conclude that kind of global Britain has failed as a trade strategy, and that therefore it is time to rethink what the UK's trade strategy should look like going forward, and that some form of reset of relations with the EU should be part of that discussion. And then we can get into a lot more detail about exactly what an EU reset, where it could potentially be beneficial. Okay, so why do I say global Britain has failed? Right. Let's start by reminding ourselves what the idea of global Britain was. It was the idea that outside the EU, the UK would be able to kind of reorient its trade towards the rest of the world, and that this would unleash British trade to kind of become a global trading superpower. We've now got kind of 8 years, 4 years since Brexit, 8 years since the referendum, to see kind of how that's worked. And it just hasn't worked, okay? And it hasn't worked along a number of different dimensions. Firstly, we haven't succeeded in getting new trade agreements with any of the big players in the global economy. We haven't got a deal with the US. We haven't got a deal with China. Talks are ongoing with India, but they haven't concluded a deal there so far. Okay, so we haven't kind of succeeded in kind of luring one of the big fish in that sense. We have negotiated, as Catherine kind of rightly just mentioned, there have been new deals with Australia and New Zealand, and we've joined the Pacific Trade Agreement. And these are all welcome in their own right, but they're also teeny. The government's own analysis produced under the last government suggests each of those deals is worth less than 1/10 of 1% of GDP in terms of economic benefit. So, great, but frankly, kind of trivial in the big scheme of things. And then the third thing is, if you look at the performance of UK trade since the referendum and since Brexit, it hasn't been great. There hasn't been this surge in trade. When you adjust goods trade for inflation, our goods trade adjusted for inflation is lower last year than it was in 2016. We just haven't seen that big growth. And now, I think there are a lot of factors behind that, and Brexit probably isn't the main one. But if we thought that there was going to be this kind of rapid growth in trade with the rest of the world, it simply hasn't happened. Okay? So why has global Britain failed as an idea? Kind of why didn't it work out? I think there are 2 reasons, which I'd summarize as 1, geography, and 2, timing. Okay? So geography. The closest thing there is to kind of a law of economics is that you trade more with countries that are closer to you and that are really big. Right? This is what economists refer to as gravity models of trade, and they're really important. And the EU is a big market, very close to the UK, so the EU is always going to be the UK's biggest trading partner. That doesn't necessarily mean we should only prioritize trade relations with the EU, but any trade strategy that tries to kind of simply ignore our trade relations with the EU is, I think, kind of doomed to failure. So that's the geography part. But then there's also the timing part, right? And this was more just bad luck, right? The last decade has really been the first decade since the Second World War where the global trading system has kind of shut down rather than opened up. If Brexit had happened in the 1990s and we'd gone to the US and asked for a trade deal, I think we'd have got one, and it could have been quite ambitious. But the US isn't in a mood to do trade deals now, right? And that's reflected in a kind of turn away from free trade in many other countries. So we've been unlucky with the timing and haven't been able to, sort of move forward and get those new trade deals that we may have hoped to. So, if we accept the premise that, global Britain has failed and is not the future of the UK's trade strategy, what can we do? Right? And there's where I think, Starmer, however frustratingly vague he often is, has a point that it is time to kind of re-examine whether there are ways to kind of improve our relations with the EU. But in doing that, we need to be very, honest about what is possible. If we don't want to go back into the single market and the customs union, or even to rejoin the EU, right? And I think there's clearly not a majority in the country to do any of those things at this time. There aren't going to be major changes to our trade relationship with the EU. If we want to find major economic benefits, you have to make those kind of major steps towards integrating with the EU. Right? Clearly, we're not going to do that in the near future. So what scope is there for a kind of more minor rearrangement of the relationship, for a more minor EU reset? It's limited, right? There are areas where you could potentially reduce some of the frictions with the EU while remaining outside the customs union and single market. I think there's scope to do better in terms of a veterinary agreement, which would benefit agricultural trade. You can also look at opportunities for, the EU would like a youth mobility scheme. Labour has kind of said it at this time isn't interested in that because it thinks it's too close to freedom of movement. Frankly, I think that's kind of nonsense. There's a clear conceptual difference between freedom of movement, which is anyone can come here and work if they want to, and young people can come here to work or live for a few years and then they have to go back. So there is scope for some steps to improve the relationship. And then final thing I would say is there is also scope to keep trade costs down by not diverging further in cases when it's not in the UK's interest. And here I think I would actually agree with a lot of what Catherine said, which is that outside the EU, we are free to set our own regulations. And there's a trade-off between being able to tailor regulations to the UK's specific needs. And Catherine gave some great examples of where we can potentially do this. But also, the more you diverge from the EU, the harder it is to trade with the EU. So you've got to kind of do that cost-benefit trade-off when you're thinking about designing the UK's regulatory architecture. And I think that should be part of the reset as well. Thank you.
Very well.
Thanks, Phil. Lovely to be here. I didn't vote to leave the EU. So if you did, this screw-up is on you. And it's on you because you were sold a pup, and a really, really poor one as well. I mean, look, those people who say that this was about controlling the border and this was about not letting in people from Europe, but letting in loads of other people from all around the other side of the world, more than doubling the immigration numbers in this country, complete disgrace. Grand Old Duke of York marching people up the hill only to march them down again. Politicians in this country have to be very, very careful with playing around with people's emotions like that. People voted because they wanted the numbers to come down, and they haven't come down. Do I want to go back? No, I don't, because I'm a Democrat. So despite the polling figures, and I'll just read them to you, YouGov last December 23, 52% of Britons believe that leaving the EU was the wrong decision. 57% would support joining the EU single market with free movement. 22% are opposed, and 72% want the UK to have closer ties with the EU. So do I, but I don't want to go back because I'm a Democrat, and there is no mandate to go back at all. Who apart from me realizes this? One Keir Starmer. Now look, once he's got past dealing with the Taylor Swift issues that he's been having over the summer, he will get round to thinking about what he wants with the EU. He's talked about having a reset of the relationship. The mood music has changed, clearly. He's been touring European capitals. He hosted the European Political Community Summit in Blenheim Palace. So the mood music has changed. But there is a very clear reason why the Labour government will not go running back to the arms of the EU. And it's not because they don't want to increase trade and achieve growth, to Thomas's point. It is because of the raw politics of the situation in which they find themselves. Yes, they got a whopping big majority based on 33% of the popular vote. They know that it's wafer thin, and if they have a hint of wanting to go back, those seats on the red wall will be going the other way. And also, there's no point trying to suck up to the Southerners who voted Lib Dem. They've gone. Those 70 seats are gone. They're not coming back. They're with the Lib Dems. We call it yellow peril. Once they're in, they work really hard. They do loads of leaflets. They bore people they bore people's senses with their leafleting, but they stick around, the Lib Dems, right? So forget about it. It's done. So what can be done here? Three things that I think they're going to focus on. The first is around trade. So the point is this, that the trade flows between the EU and the UK are it's the most important trading bloc we have, right? So over 40%, 42% of our exports go there, 52% of our imports come from there. We need to have a better trading arrangement. Now, the trading cooperation agreement is there, but is it going to be a whole-scale rewrite? Are we going to join the single market? Of course we're not, because freedom of movement is not on the table. That is why Starmer, to be fair, is not entertaining this German youth mobility scheme, because he knows it's politically incendiary. It's not going to happen. So what we're going to have is the policy of tinkering around the edges. So far from Europhilia, this is basically a policy of Euro-agnosticism. The Labour Party vaguely wants to improve its relations with Europe, but it's not prepared to die in a ditch over it because it's not politically expedient to do so. So there'll be some tinkering around. There might be some chemicals agreement to avoid being part of the single market. But this is actually going to also upset the EU because they're saying on their side, what do you want? What do you want? You're coming here making the right noises. What do you actually want from us? This is not Woolworths. This is not the pick and mix approach to being part of Europe. What do you want from us? And we've got to be clear. And so far, they're not even entertaining. Labour's not entertaining the youth mobility scheme, and the EU's not entertaining a thing for touring musicians, which is, up to them. And I'm a DJ, right? It would probably help me if I could go around touring Europe without any issues. No frictionless issues, even though we only go around with a USB stick nowadays when we're DJing, but still. So that's one thing. The first thing is around trade and economics. The second thing is around security and defense. Now, here I'm a bit more hopeful because the EU needs us. And why do they need us? Because there's a war going on the eastern flank of Europe, in case nobody had noticed, in Ukraine, which is not exactly going in a particularly positive direction. The EU understands that we, as one of the two nuclear-armed states of European powers in NATO, are pretty flipping important, right? If the EU wants to sort out its security. And even Macron realizes this particular issue. So I do think there's probably going to be more cooperation around security and foreign affairs in that particular area. There's talk about a UK-German security pact. We'll see what the details of that are. But I do think that in an environment where the US election's only a few days away, we have no idea what's going to happen there. If Trump gets back in, all bets are off in terms of what happens with NATO, although I think his bark is worse than his bite. So I do think we have to be taking more responsibility for our own security in Europe. That is going to be a key thing, and that's a serious thing where the UK can play an important role. Now, I think the third element of this is around culture and environment. So on the environmental part of the policy here, this is a challenge that we all face. And I think that there's going to be potentially some cooperation that can happen there in terms of agreements, the way we go forward. We know that this is also high on the agenda of the new incoming Labour, the new Labour government, talking about greening the economy and everything else. They need to take people with them. We're seeing the problems that Europe has had with the rise of the AfD, partly around decarbonisation policy. But I do think that there are areas of cooperation there. And I also think there are cultural areas of cooperation, although I'm not hopeful with this youth movement scheme because, as I say, Starmer has vetoed it so far because he knows it will absolutely look appalling to actually be introducing freedom of movement. So, in conclusion, what is the Labour vision of Europe going forward? Not much. It's sort of incremental steps because it's too politically difficult and incendiary to do anything more radical. We'll see where they go. The music has changed. The devil will be in the detail, and the hard stuff comes when you're actually trying to negotiate amendments to trade agreements. We shall see where it goes.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. It appears that I'm a pup salesman, so hi there. So that pup which we sold, actually, I disagree with Ali a bit there in the sense that I was absolutely convinced one of the entertaining questions I would regularly ask prior to the referendum was, what's the country going to look like in 10 years' time? You get your referendum, you leave the European Union, what's it going to look like? And my answer was, I haven't a clue. I have no idea whatsoever. And that's deliberate. The whole point was putting the direction of our country back in the hands of our countrymen and women. And they could vote for Corbyn if they so desired, and they could vote for Farage if they so desired, but it would be up to them. It would not be up to some planner in a room in Brussels. And that was the whole point. And the economic argument was important, but it wasn't the point. It really wasn't the point. I seem to recall this, but if you leave the European Union, there will be a reduction in the growth of GDP by 2% over 15 years, and therefore it will be worth 100 billion. It's fantasy figures. We can't make plans for what happens in 2 years' time. The idea of having ideas and settled ideas of what our growth and how our economy would go in 10 to 50 years hence was for the birds, utterly for the birds. But that being said, you talk about the phosphate and global Britain, I would say one of the major problems in the post-2016 position was that we were led by governments that saw Brexit as a disaster to be mitigated rather than an opportunity to be grasped. And you mentioned the fact we don't have a trade deal with the US. In 2016, Trump was elected the most pro-UK president in recent history, if not ever. And yet, European governments and our own government were so terrified of toxic Trump, we did not take advantage of that opportunity to build that free trade agreement while the sun shone. And then we have American governments that are not in favour of this country particularly, and we lost that golden opportunity, and that was entirely our fault. And so I think it is a significant problem. Now, yes, the Pacific Trade Agreement, the ANZUS Trade Agreement, and things of this sort, these are drops in the right direction, but they're not massive. However, the great European economic landmass is a reducing landmass. Its share of global trade is reducing significantly over a period of time, and I do not see that corner being turned. It is not going to be the economic tiger of future years. It just isn't. And so should we be focusing all our trading campaign and the way we're looking at future trade deals on a diminishing market? It's a big one. It's an important one. It has that gravity you mentioned. Absolutely. But should that be our focus? Well, no, we do have to look globally, whether we be very good at it or not. There I agree. We haven't been good at it. We could do better. We could do much better. And I think the India deal is on its way. It's pretty damn close now. Doing a major trading deal with China? Right now, geopolitics aside, no, you can't have geopolitics aside. Do I really want to have a major trading deal with China when China's major interest is to ensure that the West loses? I don't think we have a political class that has the backbone to do a trading deal with a country like China that has no interest in playing anything other than hardball. So I think I wouldn't say we stay out of the market when it comes to China, but we have to be very careful where long spoons time with the Chinese market and the Chinese governance and how they do trade deals. But I mean, one thing which I thought was very interesting, a couple of days ago, the Süddeutsche Zeitung wrote an interesting comment about how Britain is approaching its new relations with the European Union, coming back to the EU as our debate is titled. Oh, the question they asked is, what apart from nice pictures with important people in Brussels and a better tone does Keir Starmer really want from the EU? And actually, David Lammy going to the Foreign Affairs Council this week, that event you were talking about in Blenheim, it's icy, isn't it? It's not actually cake. And it doesn't seem to me to have anything substantial. They're talking about defence agreements. Well, when it comes to procurement, when it comes to defence, and Trump, as you said, his bike is working his bark, and when it comes to, bark is working his bite, when it comes to NATO, Trump was only making those points because he wanted the European Union countries to actually pay their ruddy way. Right now, Germany has improved since the Ukraine. But by and large, there are precious few countries in Europe that are part of NATO who actually pay their way. And his threat isn't, I'm not going to defend you. It's, I want you to pay. And that's only fair, because America's been paying for our defence and the European defence since the war, while we'll be building up a welfare state to weaken ourselves. And I'm sorry, America doesn't feel that way anymore. So, are we going back to the EU, as the question asked? Yeah, tone, yes, they want to have nice trips, they want to, ideally, Ali will be able to go around Europe and bash his decks, but I don't think it is advise it. I don't think it's going to happen. And I don't think the European Union is interested in that which we have to offer in a practical sense. What can we offer? A few battalions. Well, actually, our armed force is such a mess at present. I'm not sure those battalions are any good. But other than that, they see a market, and they see a team, a negotiating team, that's probably worse than the one that went out before. So they think an opportunity is there. But beyond that, I can't see it. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. That's great in terms of an ideal range of views on this question. So that's off to a good start. So over to you guys.
You're looking for an ideal model of Europe. We had one, 1973, when Edward Heath's government joined what was known as the Common Market. And it was an agreement between 12 nations for economic reasons, for free trade. But then since then, we've had the Maastricht Treaty, and Lord knows how many other agreements, and it's morphed into a federalised communist bloc, in my opinion. It's like an Eastern Bloc, and it's a closed market. Like, say, you get free trade, no tariffs in between the 28 nations, but then anything outside of that market is basically, it's difficult to trade with them. And that's why Britain wanted its own independent trading negotiations through the World Trade Organization or whatever they're using now. But the problem is, you look at Norway in 1994. Norway put it out to a referendum like the UK did over Brexit. Do you want to join the EU, which had just become the EU then? What was it? 54% of the Norwegian population said no. We want nothing to do with Brussels. We're happy to be independent and sovereign, and we're happy to have a sovereign wealth fund. We've got us oil and gas, and we've got our own fishing industry. We don't want that interfering with. So, yeah, there is an ideal model for Europe, I agree, but not the model that the EU became. It morphed into something that was a behemoth.
Very much. If this were here first, did sounds? Yes, yourself, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. I voted Brexit. I'm fond of Tony Benn, George Galloway, Peter Shaw, Barbara Castle. So don't tar me with the right-wing brush. Thank you very much.
No,
but that's the common insult I get. That's the common insult I get from EU Remainers. And I was married to a woman of mixed race from Mauritius, and she got racial abuse that I hadn't heard since the 70s. So from the 70s, from people from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And my Jewish friends getting anti-Semitism that I hadn't heard for a long time. Right? We've got drunk drivers killing people, driving into my wife's car, driving into my cousin's car, writing them off. 15% of fatal traffic accidents in North Yorkshire are due to East Europeans. And over a 10-year period, we had 100 sex offences, rapes, 10 of them in sexually motivated murders by people with previous convictions within the Eastern Bloc, and we're allowed to come and go as they please due to the freedom of movement. I'm not interested in trade.
Okay.
I'm interested in the safety of British citizens and the European Court overturning sentences applied to people like the Bolger killers, not trade.
Not questioning your points, I'm just saying, in terms of looking at the relationship of EU, Britain in the future.
A relationship? We had one in 1973.
You're happy with that? Yeah. But your voice is well made, sir.
Hi, I'm an Eastern European. I think my main question is, I see that the Starmer government is not shy from being moralistic on the world stage. I think we've seen David Lemmy's interventions at the UN Security Council, which were completely, had nothing to do with the topic. He just, he has a line he likes to bring out every time he has a chance. So how will this moralistic government deal with a potential, what's the lady in France, with the potential Le Pen government, or with the potential far-right government in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Germany? This is potentially, in the future of Europe, in 5 to 10 years? How will Britain deal with this new political force?
Great question, right? I was curious because, well, I share your concerns, but I come from the right on that topic because I did vote for Brexit. But my concern is that we are the second largest service exporter in the world. And how does the gravity theory of trade apply to service exports?
Question.
Thank you. During the referendum campaign, I'm from an agricultural background, and we felt that sheep, not to put a pun on it, were going to be the sacrificial lamb, inasmuch as we produce far more sheep meat in this country than we can consume, and we are very heavily reliant on the EU as a primary export market. When the time came at the end of the transition period, I think it was 2020, rather than collapse, the sheep meat price shot up. They wanted our product, and there was what was called a pull factor. We were pushing our sheep meat at Europe, but they were pulling. They wanted it. And although there has been some increased red tape, that particular disaster zone has not been met. You know, that was one of these scare tactics that we were told. I have a friend who makes barometers. His main market was the Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, etc. Those barometers contained mercury. The EU banned him from putting mercury in his barometers, despite the fact that most of them were not sold in the EU. His business suffered very badly. Now we're out of the European Union. He could, if he was still trading, go back to that. We would have the freedom. So the point really is you do what your customer wants. So if you have a customer in Europe that insists on widgets are painted black, then the firms in this country will paint them black. You don't need Keir Starmer saying, from now on, all widgets in this country must be painted black.
Thank you. Well, I voted to remain, but like Ali, I'm a Democrat. And I think the simple reason we can't go back is free movement. I mean, Britain and the EU have voted, countries in the EU, time and again to reduce immigration, and time and again it fails to happen. Maloney's just set up the scheme in Albania and judges have intervened. We've had a Rwanda scheme. And if Europe doesn't address this question, people will keep voting for people and it will get more and more unpleasant. In 1999, Austria was isolated because they dared to have what was then judged a far-right government, a far-right party in government. That now topped the polls. So if the EU doesn't address these issues in a democratic and sensible manner, people will still vote to address it, and we will get more and more extreme, and we will all suffer from that.
Yes. Okay, one more, then we'll go back to the panel for any responses.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the opening speeches. They were really brilliant from all four of you. Thank you for that. My point is really just a quick rebuttal to, I think it's Mr. Thompson, is that right?
Thomas.
Thomas, I beg your pardon, sorry. So I do apologise. You said that we now have 8 years of data that proves that global Britain has failed. Now, I didn't vote primarily on economic grounds. I voted on political grounds. But we haven't got 8 years of data that prove that global Britain has failed because we didn't finalise Brexit until 2019. Following 2019, we then went straight into COVID. And the global market collapsed and just shut down. So for 2 years, we had a shutdown of the global market. So there's no proof there at all that global Britain failed in any way, shape or form. And that's just my point. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. No problem at all. Just a quick one on the first point about the ideal for European Union. Personally, my ideal with the Hanseatic League. Forget to set you two. Go back to the Hanseatic League, where it's independent countries and states were trading on their own thing, having free trade with each other, but maintaining their entire cultural and political institutions. So, Hansa League is my perfect ideal when it comes to a European trading mechanism. But that slightly silly point aside, I do think that the far right aspects of the European Union. by and large, whilst a lot of the debates, as I mentioned in my speech, a lot of the debates during the referendum and since have been about economics and trade and what we are talking about here, that's not why people voted. And it's also not what people are voting on the continent. As we see what happened in Germany, what happened in Austria, Haidar did it in 1999, and now the FPO are back with different leadership. You see the rise of Vox in Spain. You see the rise of what in Britain we'd call the hard right across the continent, and that is because people are increasingly concerned about the impact of mass migration. What we do not see yet is any sounds and any soundings in the European institutions that this is serious. What we do see is national governments are starting to wake up. They really are. They're having to, because the votes are going in that direction. But what we see the institutions of the European Union and Brussels sticking their fingers in the air and going, nah, it's not happening. And sadly, that will break in the end. There will be the Council of Ministers and the Commission will be finding themselves at hammer and tongs. I can't pretend, and I know there's at least one person in this room who can tell me much more. I can't pretend that I watched the results of the European Parliament elections this year very closely. Thank God I don't have to watch. Because trust me, as a former UKIP and then Brexit party, you can imagine I watched what was going on in the European Parliament far more than is good for anybody. But right now, I don't know what the impact has been there, but I can see that there is an increasing falling out between governments and the European Union institutions. And I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch as it plays out over the next few years.
Thanks. There was a really interesting question about services trade and gravity. Kind of one of the surprising things is that gravity actually works really well for services trade in the same way that it does for goods trade. If you look at the kind of effect of distance on trade, it's basically the same for services as it is for goods. And that's telling you something about how proximity matters, not just because of the physical costs of moving goods, but it matters because it's easier to do business with people that are nearer, because sometimes you have to travel there and it reduces.
Surely the English language and the common law is just as proximity as geographical proximity.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So those are also going to be factors that matter, right? But geographical proximity is another one. And, we are very near the EU, which is why we end up doing, part of the reason why we end up doing a lot of our trade with the East.
Not true.
Companies there.
I know, wait.
Then go. So what?
Okay. I'm going to, a lot of people actually with their questions have sort of answered what we've just heard. We have very good trade statistics. I can tell you that our largest export market is the US. It's not close. Our largest import supplier is China, and that will become much, much bigger because for a long time China has been sending us parts, and soon they're going to be sending us whole products, which you see already with the electric vehicle. They're not content to just send us the little bits and let us assemble them in the UK. We're going to start getting the whole product, and then you're going to see that number double because suddenly the value added is going to be in China, not being put together in the UK. Our biggest market for services is also the US by a long shot. In fact, in things like insurance, we export 4 or 5 times more to the US than our next biggest market, which is Ireland. And a lot of Ireland is, as most of you will know, a kind of fake economy with US companies basing themselves out of Ireland for tax reasons. So you could almost add the Ireland statistics to the US one. When you actually look at granular trade statistics, which I do all the time, you see that the whole gravity model is rubbish. It used to work when we were members of the EU, but now we've got exact trade figures from HMRC, and we're not using the Eurostat figures, which were basically made up because they had to guesstimate how much stuff was going across borders when there was no paperwork, something that so many people are regretting that they don't have anymore. So constantly, things were double counted all the time. And if you and not just for us, they're double counted for Germany. Germany imports milk from all the countries on its east side, and it exports milk to all the countries on its west side. And Stat counts both of those. And you go, how often does a Polish dairy supply milk to someone in Denmark? Probably every day. But that's not happening. We're going to not count that. We're going to count Germany in the middle. And that is, I could bore you for Britain on that one. But I'm going to talk about immigration because I'm an immigrant. And I can tell you, though you look at the top line statistics, which for immigration look terrible, but our government is able to determine who gets a work visa, how much they have to earn. Also, when you come in with a visa, it's a 3-year visa. You can extend maybe to a 4-year. If you're lucky, you get to become a permanent resident, but that isn't guaranteed. And they've recently introduced a payment to use the NHS so that if you get a work visa, the person who got your work visa also has to pay about £1,000 each year for you to use the NHS. If we go back to free movement, not only can anyone from the EU come into the UK, whether they have a job or they don't have a job, but they also get immediate access to all UK social benefits. So not just the NHS, but they can also get unemployment benefits, they can get on the housing list, they can get housing benefits, whether they've contributed to the tax base or not. And this is also true of EU students. EU students used to come to UK universities because they are the best universities in the world, or second best maybe, but they only paid the same rates as a UK student. Since we left, they've had to pay the same rates as a student from China or India or Mexico or Australia or whatever, which has been a great boom for our university sector, who Mr. Thomas is benefiting from people paying more, which is sure he's happy about. Okay.
I just wanted to pick up the point about the ideal model that was mentioned about the early 70s. I mean, this is a question that the Labour government is going to have to grapple with. I mean, what model does it actually want to have? Because going back into the single market is not on the table. I don't even think that the Labour government is talking about that because of the reasons I mentioned about the whole freedom of movement issue and how difficult that is. The question is then, what do you do? What kind of model do you have? Do you try and have some sort of agreements where you can improve the non-tariff barriers, the paperwork, and all these other issues that are affecting medium-sized businesses in this country that knew that it would actually be not frictionless, this trade, and it certainly is not frictionless. What do you do about that? The question then is, do you believe in dynamic alignment? If you believe in dynamic alignment, one of the main reasons for leaving was that you could forge your own path and do all these other trade deals where you don't have to dynamically align with the EU standards and all the rest of it. So this is the question. This is actually going to be the real test of what Labour does. Forget about single market. What's it actually going to do on dynamic alignment? That is what is the question is going to be. And to what extent is that going to hamper us by doing our own things otherwise? Now, that said, there's a fundamental thing here which was mentioned about immigration, and I'm just going to make it very, very clear. I think you mentioned that if the immigration issue is not addressed by European leaders, and it is not being addressed by European leaders, right? It is simply not. I think we're heading to a very dark place in Europe. We're heading to a very dark place potentially here as well, although we have more sensible people here who are engaging in this than some of the people in Europe. But there are some dark forces here too. And you only have to look at the riots over the summer to realize what's going on. You keep pushing people down a road, and this is not, by the way, a justification for rioting or harassing people or putting fireworks into mosques, which I think is absolutely abhorrent. But if you keep pushing people in a direction where they're not listened to, they're consistently and persistently ignored, and they keep telling you that we want immigration to come down, and consistently in election after election, then they vote to leave the EU, then you still ignore them. And then in the latest round of voting in Austria, in Italy, in France, in Spain, in all of these countries, in Germany now, the AfD in control of one of the regions. I'm not sure it's going to be in government, but still the majority of the vote. This is really, really dangerous stuff. I mean, the EU leaders need to wake up on this particular issue, and so do we. This is not a question of Labour running back to the arms of the EU. It's Labour sorting out one of the fundamental reasons why people voted to leave in the first place, and that was to bring down the numbers.
Right, okay. Next round, microphone. I'll come to you in a minute, Bruno.
Yeah. In 1994, when I was a mere 30 years old, I attended my first Transport and General Workers Union conference, at which that union pledged to support the campaign against the tampon tax, which, if you remember, was compulsory VAT applied to feminine hygiene products. And it was universally agreed that this was a stupid tax and unfair and discriminatory against women, particularly younger women. When was that campaign, cross-party, well-supported, trade unions, when was it finally achieved? And the answer is we left the EU notionally in 20, but in fact the transition period took us to early 21, and the 0% was finally applied then. What's that, maybe 30 years? This is the sort of problem that Labour will come up against time and again if it embarks down this road. But for as long as we've got people like Thomas Sampson and so many other people that criticise the Brexit decision and go on about the need to rejoin in some way this authoritarian empire, those of us that did vote for Brexit, often for very left-wing reasons, will have to remain extremely watchful. This is an anti-democratic organisation. We need to make sure that its deceits, like Ali's inability to get a visa to go and perform music, are called out for what they are, and the hypocrisy when at the same time they will not control illegal migration over the channel in ways that are killing people. Their hypocrisy needs to be challenged. We need to carry on fighting this campaign that all of us thought we won in 2016.
I get rather over-liberal paraphrasing of what Thomas said. Than that. Yes, the gentleman there in the yellow, it's a green, then that lady.
Thank you very much. I think if we run towards the EU, we'll be running against the grain. The reality is that EU skepticism, not Euroscepticism, is growing in Europe. I say this, my family's Polish, I was born here. And the European elections have been mentioned, and of course the rise of the EU skeptic, the right parties in Europe, is largely down to mass migration. Now, the reality is that restrictions on cross-border movement between countries within the EU is going to have to become a reality. It's going to become a political reality and very quickly. And the irony, perhaps, in all of this is that the best analogy, actually, to this is a ship's bulkhead. If you have multiple sealable cabins within the bulkhead, the hull of a ship, if you have an external breach on that ship and the floodwaters are contained within one of those bulkheads and they don't enter all the others, so actually having those strong internal borders saves the whole ship as a whole. That's the best analogy to do with the EU, and the EU will have to do the same. And ironically, it won't be the EU that will unify Europe. It will be national border protection. Thank you.
I think the Labour Party is trying to take us much closer to the EU, but it's having to do it by stealth, because despite the polls that you quoted, and that people wouldn't stand for it. We made a decision. The problem was that we, the population, didn't make sure how that decision was implemented. Every single political parliamentary party opposed us leaving the EU, and after we had the referendum, every single parliamentary political party did their damnedest to stop that happening, and the EU, on the other side, did its damnedest to make sure we had an extraordinarily poor deal. Brexit is not the same as global Britain. That term came up was devised by Boris Johnson, not by the people who voted for Brexit. And the thing is, it's the same people all the time. And the reason they like global Britain or they like the EU is because they've given up on the idea of the sovereign national states because of the pesky population. They might actually make demands for themselves rather than have things imposed.
Very well done.
I think the reset was happening anyway. The reset was happening before the elections. So that was happening anyway. It's a good idea. It's a good idea to have good relations with the people next to you. Gravity trade, notwithstanding, the low point in those relations was, of course, the sort of vaccine nationalism of the EU nearly at one point in 2021. But putting that to one side, a reset is a good idea. The problem with Sir Keir Starmer wanting to get closer in terms of trade relations is that the EU has what are called offensive interests. You want to get closer, you want to do this, maybe on SPS, on veterinary agreements, you want to align with chemicals regulation, then we've got demands in response. And what's really unusual is for once we actually know what the EU's offensive interests are. It's very unusual for them to publish them, and they've published them, or they've made them very clear. One of the offensive interests is the Youth Mobility Scheme. The Youth Mobility Scheme, as it's drafted by the European Commission, that's the only document we have, has quite a few pages of it, is very clearly designed to essentially dismantle Britain's migration system, its immigration system. As you said, the giving of visas, the setting of going rates, even though they're pathetically low, set at it's 25th percentile, isn't it? But those regulations, that legislation is the instrument by which Britain can, if it wants, control net migration. The fact that they have decided not to, which is a business-driven decision rather than a political decision, is the problem. Britain can do it if it wants, unlike the EU, which can't control its borders. Britain has an instrument to do it. The EU's offensive interests, the most clearly expressed, effectively dismantles that by allowing anyone aged 18 to 30 to come to Britain to work or live or be a student for 4 years. That would completely wipe it out. The other offensive interest we know about, and Britain has started a dispute under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, is about Dogger Bank, the sand eel fishing ban. France wants Britain to roll back the MPAs and stop bans on what's called bottom trawling, which is a system by which you catch fish. So the EU is actually making it very clear what it wants in return. And what it wants in return is actually very political. It has chosen two areas where Britain has most clearly gone its own way in control of its migration system, but also in terms of control of its fisheries. So let's not be naive. The EU has offensive interests. The EU is going to be political about this.
Well, thank you very much. That means Bruder Wobkill is one of the world's experts on what's going on in Brussels. We're talking about what it is in Europe tomorrow.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Oh, hello. Good afternoon. In Northern Ireland, we are very close to the EU because we're still in the EU. Does the panel find that this abandonment of Northern Ireland justified?
Great question.
I suspect I'm in minority in having voted Remain. I still don't understand how we're better off by imposing trade barriers with our biggest partners. If TTIP is an advantage, so that's one thing. And if this sovereignty is great, wouldn't it be why isn't it a great idea to have the borough of Westminster as an independent state, Berkshire as an independent state? Why don't we want to take it that far? And my biggest issue with the referendum, and the lady here was upset that she hadn't got what she wanted, that was because as the gentleman in the pink said, he didn't know there was no clear vision of what was wanted. And so there were arguments, you could sell absolutely anything. And that is why people, I think, that's never convinced me, but people here seem to be unhappy. They got what they wanted, they got what they voted for. They should own it. They should tell me why it's a wonderful thing.
Okay. Yeah, I have two confessions to make. First, I'm German and I'm working in Brussels in the belly of the beast. But I want to, So, as a German, it was a catastrophe for us that the UK left. We wanted to have them in 1973, and the reason was very clear because the Nordic countries, I call it Scandinavian, but also the Germanic-speaking countries and the UK formed a blocking minority against countries that were very happy to regulate every aspect of the economy. And since 2019, since the UK left in the last 5 years, we have seen that they have unleashed the Kraken. They have the Net Zero Industry Act, the AI Act, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. We could go on. The EU has regulated its industry and its services to a level and we have never seen before. So my warning to the UK is don't get anywhere near the EU, even though, and especially not in this dead zone where you are not in the EU, but you have to adopt every regulation that the EU has made.
Right, Ricky. Okay, so brief comments from the panel, and we'll go back to the floor for the final questions, and then some.
I totally agree with our last speaker, but I will mention Northern Ireland because it is a very serious issue. It is something that seems to have been done beyond any democratic system. There wasn't an idea within the Good Friday Agreement that there would be a vote from people in Northern Ireland as to whether they wanted to join with Ireland itself. And it would appear that through Brexit, someone in Westminster has decided to take that vote away from them and make that decision for them. And they have basically put Northern Ireland into the same barrel as Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And I believe that the original agreement was designed so that the UK could rescue Northern Ireland after it had got out of the EU. But Rishi Sunak decided to do something called the Windsor Framework, and that cemented Northern Ireland's terrible position. And they have put a border down the Irish Sea, which is outrageous. And the fact that the EU has insisted on them doing that and has threatened to take them to court if they don't uphold all of the TCA agreement between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is abominable. And there's nothing I can say other than I can't believe that our politicians who wanted their own sovereignty from the EU were quite happy to give away someone else's and have disenfranchised almost 2 million UK population, and it is unreal.
Catherine, can I just ask you, how this rescue effort for Northern Ireland was going to take place? What on earth are you referring to here? What rescue effort? There was always going to have to be a border somewhere. Major went with Blair to the border before the vote to basically make this point. If Boris Johnson and his ilk were so remiss, so utterly useless to think through the implications of this, what rescue effort? This isn't like an airlift from Afghanistan. Well, sorry, can you explain?
Actually, Mr. Kenny, who was the Prime Minister of Ireland at the time, and Theresa May had even worked out how the border would work. And they were going to, because right now, most of the transport of trade is done online. It's not actually.
Oh, the technical solution thing.
Yeah, of course. And that was going to be fine until the EU decided they could use this as a way to boss the UK around. And Varadkar was put in charge of Ireland and he joined with the EU. I think there was a deal there. I think there's something about tax. I'm guessing that the EU decided to be soft on Ireland's rather generous tax allowances. But I'm pretty sure there was a deal done. And yeah, I do think Boris was going to just walk away from his deal that it signed.
Okay, look, I think it's very disappointing what's happened, but it was totally foreseeable. There had to be a border somewhere. The EU was never going to allow a porous border, right? It was never going to allow it. Now, if anyone in the negotiations hadn't thought that through, they're absolutely useless negotiators, and they sold against the pup, and the pup was Boris Johnson in this particular case. So I'm very sorry that you feel completely let down, but you have been let down because people didn't think it through, and there was going to be a border somewhere. Absolutely going to be a border somewhere. I think the bigger question from all of this is going to be, and it comes back to the fund. Sorry, go on.
We'll let you back on development.
Yeah, the bigger question is going to be, and this is the fundamental problem with the vote. And as I say, I'm a Democrat. I do not want to have another referendum on this. It's too psychologically harmful. We have to make the best of what we have now. I'm not one of those people who says, people were thick who voted Brexit. No, absolutely not. I'm a Democrat. People wanted it. They do it. We have to make the best out of it. The problem with all of it is you had two models that were totally incompatible. You had the Daniel Hannan Singapore-on-Thames model on one hand, and you had the Nigel Farage model where we're going to reduce immigration on the other. They're not compatible. We still need to work it out. Maybe the Labour government will work it out at some point.
Thanks. So I think it's really interesting that, like, the vast majority of the comments are in one way or another about freedom of movement, right? That's the issue that people in this room are clearly still most exercised about. And without kind of, taking any stance on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I do just want to reiterate something Ali said in his opening remarks, which is there is no chance under this Labour government that they will do anything that brings back freedom of movement. That is simply not on the table. Yeah. Keir Starmer is a smart enough politician to know that that's not going to happen. Yeah. So the discussion now in terms of, the actual EU reset, it's not about freedom of movement. It's about kind of what can be done while kind of, maintaining those, they're the red lines for Labour. And I think this is one area where I would characterise the kind of opportunities for youth mobility slightly differently from some of the ways we've heard, which is I think the EU's asking for youth mobility, not as a way of undermining and bringing back freedom of movement by the back door, but because it thinks you can have a youth mobility agreement while still not going back to freedom of movement, that you can do it kind of through visas in similar ways that we have youth mobility schemes with other countries. So, I think there's going to be a much bigger discussion about that, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get some kind of youth mobility scheme, but Starmer will never sign off on it if it is perceived as being freedom of movement. So that's just not where the discussion is going to be during this parliament.
Yeah. Firstly, I agree with Catherine and the German commentator. The Europe isn't static; it's dynamic, and by gosh, it's dynamic in the wrong direction when it comes to regulation. So no, thank you. And I think it would be. I can't believe a British government would even try and rejoin what has happened since. But on Ulster, the only word I wrote down was abomination, and I disagree with Ali here. It's actually not hard. It really isn't. Yes, there has to be a border somewhere. It has to be the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That's pretty damn simple. There is a thing called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. They are part of our country. It is part of us. What on earth are we doing, getting in a halfway house to be governed by a bunch of coroners? I'm sorry, not having that. And any argument suggests that we should have this halfway house. Any argument suggests we should put 2 million of our citizens on a boat and say, sod off, we're not interested, I think is a disgrace. A constitutional, democratic disgrace. So I won't have any... and on the final point, sorry about that, but that really gets my goat, is that I think you're right, and I think actually the likelihood of a free movement deal being done, if it is perceived to be a breach of free movement, as Bruno was suggesting, then it's not going to happen. But I think the point is that Bruno was making, and I think he made it very well, this is their offensive approach to the negotiations. That is what they wanted from it, which is why it will not happen.
Okay, what?
Sorry, anybody who hasn't spoken before?
Lady here.
Yeah, just a question back on the youth movement point.
Yeah.
Is it not possible that the EU wants that because they want their people to be able to come here? That always seems to be what I've always assumed.
What they want.
Yeah, that's what they want.
They've got an unemployment problem,
Do you want to come in yet? Gentlemen? No?
Thank you very much. I'd just like to make a general point of content over presentation. The lady in particular knows what she's talking about.
Thanks. I'll say that was not that funny.
I just want to mention, so as I mentioned before, I'm Eastern European. I'm from Romania. And so I kind of have learned a lot of lessons about how the EU operates internally. I think one of the points you made, sir, that the EU was never going to accept a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I think it is very important to note the hypocrisy of the European Union when they talk about their so-called values or lines that they cannot cross. For instance, I'm going to give a few examples. When Angela Merkel said we can welcome 1 million Syrian refugees to Germany without consulting any country in Europe, completely blindsiding Greece, Bulgaria, Austria, Hungary, and so on. And those countries tried to put pressures on their borders and put checks. Germany said, what are you doing? Have you never heard of open borders? If you put checks on your borders, we're going to sanction you and whatever. What has Germany done at the 16th of September this year? There are checks at every single German border, and that is because Germany does not care. This whole conversation about European values, it is bull. The only value they have is self-interest. When we had COVID, we had those very strong restrictions on you couldn't leave your house in Romania. People had to fill a declaration before they left their house saying, I'm going to this point, I'll be back by, I don't know, half an hour from now and whatever. If the police caught you, you had to provide that proof, and however, there was huge limits on people's freedoms. However, when Germany said, hang on a minute, most of our asparagus pickers are Romanians, we need those pickers to come in. All of a sudden, you had tens of thousands of Romanians in a shocking display of supplication of Romania to Germany and to the European Union that had to crowd into busy airports in the south of Romania, in Transylvania, waiting to get on the planes to go and pick bloody German asparagus. So don't talk to me about European values and they will never accept this. They will bloody well accept whatever is in their personal economic interest as countries.
Just to say, we hear a lot about the Irish border, Northern Ireland. It's a total bluff. If we hadn't had that border in the North Sea, is an Irish government, which is dedicated to United Ireland, really going to impose border controls on that border? It's not going to. We even had dissident Republicans in Northern Ireland complaining when the prospect is that they wanted to attack border stations, but they wanted to attack the British ones. They didn't want to attack the Irish ones. It was a total bluff, but nobody had the guts to call the bluff.
Okay, I think it's just two more got. All right, I'll take you as well. So then we'll take the two at the front here first, and then the gentleman there, and then it'll be the platform in reverse order. So you'll be first.
It's possible that the Irish problem, if you want to call it that, might well solve itself. And that's because in Northern Ireland, the Sinn Féin get a bigger and bigger and bigger share of the vote. And ultimately, if that carries on, they will be the government in Northern Ireland. They will rejoin the Republic, and they will all go happily into the EU. I think that's quite likely.
Yep. Really that way.
Personally don't, but as a subject for another session, and open that up too much more. We'll take, given we have 5 minutes to go, this one, and then at the back there.
Well, thank you again. A very brief point to Mr. Ali. He said that, a very good speech, you said there has to be a border somewhere. I think you're right. There does have to be a border somewhere. But if there is a border, then it ought to be along the border with the United Kingdom and not anywhere else. And if there's to be any decision about placing it anywhere else, like the North Sea, that ought to be a decision for the people of Northern Ireland rather than the people of Westminster. But that's my point. Thank you.
Okay, you want the code?
I have different theory about the service and immigration. For the service, it's common law and English is really advantage. But you can see actually the figure is the service is a huge job after Brexit. As well, the immigration is a huge waste after the Brexit also. So I think the free movement actually is not the factor of the immigration. Actually, like the settlement scheme, if they think that there's still can work here, they would not be so concerned about the immigration. But now they need to fill the gap of the economy. That's have many immigrant visa like Hong Kong visa. So like me, come to here to fill up the economic gap. So it's like why is being increased of the immigration instead of the lower. Yeah, that's my point.
I could probably speak for about half an hour, but I'll try not to. I lived through the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years in the 1980s when you had hunger strikes, people being shot, people being blown up. I'm horrified that you would suggest that there should be a border between Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland, because you'd have that same scenario happening again. I lived through it. I know what it means. It's horrific. And to suggest we should have a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland is quite dangerous, to say the least. The first time I spoke about this, I was very emotional. I didn't realise how much it had impacted me as I lived through that time. I'm a little more able to speak about it now, but I can't stress it too much. Going back to the debate itself, Catherine, you suggested, you brought across a picture as if somebody in Brussels decides all these things. They don't. The 28 member states sit down and decide what they want to do. So there's very good voice from the UK. I lived there for 10 years as well. I saw it all happening. And I saw the UK bringing a very good voice to the table. And it's a pity it's gone. But it wasn't somebody in a suit in Brussels making the decisions. That's not correct. It was 28 member states. And I saw it in Ireland when I lived there. The politicians, when they had to make a tough decision, they blamed it on Brussels. But they took the decision. They just didn't admit it. So I represent international companies bringing medical foods and various other products into the UK. It's costing us more money and more administration all the time. And Brexit is the gift that keeps giving. We're having to deal with new requirements next April, which will add more costs. It's brought no benefit. And we should have a veterinary agreement, please. That would remove an awful lot of the cost and make it much easier. And finally, well, maybe that's enough for the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe. Okay, concluding comments for us new platform. Yes, Gawain.
A couple of points. And first, thinking about from the previous round of questions, they were talking about Poland. Now, the Polish elected the more pro-European government last year, as opposed to the more PIS, the more Eurosceptic government, the more nationalist government. And yet that Polish government, led by Tusk, if I remember rightly, who has just introduced border controls, which hitherto was only the area of those ghastly right-wingers. And now he's done it himself. So it is interesting. I think the Bullock idea that was being proposed is actually happening by default, because national government, not, as I was saying before, not Brussels, not the EU, but national governments are having to, in order to respond to political movements within their own societies. And I think that's true. And our Romanian friend was saying much the same thing. Those borders should have been there, and it stopped everything coming through. And yet when you complained, you were shouted down. And thinking of borders again, and the only other points, and responding to the gentleman who's just spoken about where should the border be, you would say it should be down the North Sea. I disagree. I don't think there's any interest on the part of the UK to put up a physical border along that line between Ulster and the South. I think the only people who are pretending and threatening to do that were the South. There are you'd poo-poo the technical solutions previously, but there are. Most of the stuff they're going through could be done in an office. You don't need barbed wire and diplock courts and all the rest of it to have a border between North and South. You just don't. We have, thank God, moved on from that. And I think the gangsters, frankly, the gangsters who would like to see that, as I say, I want to blow up an English border post, I don't want to blow up a European one. Well, if the English don't build one, the British don't build one, the Brits are there. If they don't, then there's nothing to blow up. I don't think there is that need. Whilst Sinn Féin may be increasing in vote, absolutely, Sinn Féin may be increasing the vote. I note that, interestingly, the expected wipeout by Sinn Féin in the South is less likely than it was because Sinn Féin's commitment to open borders. And the people of Ireland are starting to question whether that great swing towards Sinn Féin is actually going to happen.
Thank you. Alex.
You see, there's a difference in rhetoric, of which Cicero would be proud, Gawain, of your rhetoric, and cold hard reality and actually policy making. And the difference is this: that when you're talking about Northern Ireland, This is not a difficult thing to grasp. The EU is a trading bloc. A trading bloc has borders, it has perimeters. They don't have porous borders. If there's a thing called a bloc, they'll control what comes into the bloc. They're not going to have a porous border between someone who's outside the bloc, the UK, and the bloc itself. Therefore, there was always going to be an issue around a border in Northern Ireland. So you may be up for a trade war with the EU and a situation where the Good Friday Agreement collapses. Good luck to you, sir. I'm not. This was not a difficult thing to understand. It was raised before the referendum. And the problem is, with the bluff and bluster of people like Boris Johnson who don't do the hard work, it's a bit as rude as going to the local park, getting your dog to poop all over the grass and getting Rishi Sunak to pick it up, called the Windsor Agreement. That's where we are.
Rest Richie, sir.
Captain.
Okay. Could you, Thomas?
I wanted to come back to the economics to finish with, which is Brexit has made Britain poorer, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but to date, if you look at the consensus across people who are studying this, it so far has economically made us poorer, right? The Chancellor is going to give a budget in a couple of weeks' time where she is facing a very nasty trade-off between cutting public services or raising taxes, right? And part of the contribution is that because we're poorer, there's less money to go around. And while that's the case, right, while we are facing these economic struggles, and while people think that Brexit is a part of it, people are going to be looking for ways to fix some of those issues, right? And fundamentally, that's why the Labour government is talking about the EU reset. They think there are economic benefits there, right? And you can disagree with them and think that maybe they're wrong, but that's what they think. And while they think that, they're going to be looking for ways to reimagine our relationship with the EU. So this isn't going away.
That's true. Yep. Thank you. Let's remind you, this is the battle of ideas, which means there are sometimes conflicting ideas. Well, it's your job and our collective job to listen to the ideas and challenge them, but not to act, please.
Well, to finish on, I'm going to actually agree with Thomas. I don't think Brexit made us poorer, but I do think that the press has pushed this idea to such an extreme that I think the Labour Party and some lazy politicians who haven't looked into it do believe that Europe is just as it used to be in 2015, and if we rejoin, we'll magically all turn back into 2015. But as our German commentator pointed out, Europe is not the way it was. And Mario Draghi wrote a fantastic report on all the things that's wrong with Europe, and we should not be getting anywhere near it. As for the man who spent time in Ireland and Brussels, I mean, what a life. You don't understand that your trade with Europe was never free. It's just that everyone in this room paid for it. So our money that went to the EU, whether it was in our VAT payments or whether it was in the money we paid on customs duty, or whether it was just a proportion of our national insurance, national income, we sent to Brussels so you didn't have to pay when you traded with them. But now you have to pay, and that's good because you're also taking the profits from that trade. Because our problem before was we got to pick up your tab for trading, but we didn't get any of the return. Now the people who are doing the trade, which is a very small part of our community, by the way, they are the ones who pay their own trade costs. And that's how it should be. And our big companies who've been trading all over the world managed to pay their own way when they traded with the US or China, but somehow or other it was impossible for them to fill in the forms and pay when they traded with Germany. And it's just was not on. As for who makes the rules in Brussels, I think you'll find the Commission, which does have one person from each country, will make a lot of them. But there is a side group from the Commission, I'm sure Gawain knows what they're called, who really make the decisions. And Bruno will probably be able to fill you in on how it works. But there is now qualified majority voting as well, so that, even if we were still with the German and the Nordic country blocks, I don't think we'd be making the rules anymore.
Thank you very much.